Welcome to Mercy Road Church. Hey everyone, my name is Ken Primeau, and I have the opportunity to serve here as one of the pastors. And I want to see with a show of hands, how many of you stayed up on Friday night to watch the Tyson-Jake Paul fight? All right, some people throughout the room. All right, how many of you did not care at all and you didn't really pay attention? Okay, the majority of the people in the room. How many of you were wanting to watch the fight and then it was like past midnight and you're like, I'm going to bed, I'm tapping out? Okay, yeah. I was in that camp. And it just got me thinking about in our world, right? In our culture where social media plays such a big role in so many people's everyday lives, the power that social media these influencers actually have. So much so that a YouTuber named Jake Paul was able to leverage his social media influence and turn it into a $40 million paycheck to fight Mike Tyson. Not only that, he had the power to force many of us to stay up way past our bedtimes, right? In order to try to watch that fight. And it just got me thinking about the influence that these social media influencers have. And in fact, there's many people who, because of their social media influence, the things they say, the things they do, that there are people who look to them and follow them, whether it's on fashion, whether it's on politics, or even to matters like faith. And they wield this large amounts of power over us. You remember, for example, about 10 years ago, the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. Y'all remember this? So there was this movement started on social media to raise awareness for Lou Gehrig's disease and to raise funds for it. And it became this global phenomenon, right? Where there were celebrities, even Bill Gates, right? Who were doing the Ice Bucket Challenge. And the way it was set up was you would challenge 3 other people on social media, hey, to do the Ice Bucket Challenge. And they had 24 hours to do it, or they had to donate funds to ALS research. And then I saw this meme that just, some of these were humorous, right? So let's get this straight. You waste clean water as a challenge in order to avoid raising money for charity. Yes. Sadly, that is what we did, right? But it's this power of social media influencers. Or do you remember when these social influencers started a fad of planking? Where people would just go to public places and just like lay down. This was like around 2011, and they would just lay down flat, like on a statue or a park bench or on their cubicle, and just post these ridiculous pictures. And it started this movement and convincing of other people that the ultimate way to express your creativity, right, was just laying flat somewhere random in public. Now, as I was thinking about this, I was just thinking about all of us, right? We have a desire that we want to impact the world, right? You want to make a difference with your life. You want to have influence over others. You want your life to matter. And I think in a world where there's social media influencers, we can begin to think that primarily can happen in a digital way. But I want to argue this morning that your life and the influence that you can have over others isn't going to primarily happen digitally. But it's gonna happen in your everyday life on life with others. And I think one of the most profound ways you can impact the lives of others, one of the ways you can have the most influence is actually in moments of pain, in moments of difficulty, in moments of suffering, and the way that you respond to those moments. It's in the quiet moments of suffering that you and I can have our most social influence on others. See, it's not gonna be always the moments the highlight reels that you wanna post on social media, but there's times in our lives where it's the quiet faithfulness. It's the perseverance through pain in a godly way that impacts others' lives. You see, when life gets hard, and we can get to a place where we begin to ask this question of like, is God actually in control? Because my circumstances, my relationships, the things around me might be difficult. And let me just say this, you can't always control your circumstances, but you can control how you respond to them. And how you and I show up in the moment. And how we respond to the trials in our lives and the difficulties can not only impact, here's what I want you to see, not only impact your future, but the future of others around you. And I think the place that we have the most social influence isn't digitally, but it's actually in what we call our 8 to 15, your sphere of influence. It's what the Greeks called oikos, or extended household. It's the relationships that you have, and we see that on average you have 8 to 15 people in your life that might be family, friends, neighbors, coworkers, classmates, that they have a view into your life and they see you on a regular basis, and these are the people that you most have social influence with. And instead of just thinking about how to impact the world globally, to begin to think about, God, what are the social influence that you've given me? What are the spheres of influence, and that you can make a difference in the lives of people around you? And I actually believe that the call of a Christian is a call to be someone who has experienced the reckless love that we just sang about, the reckless love of God, and then to extend that reckless love to the world around us, starting with our 8 to 15. And what I want us to see this morning is that you can make a social impact. And we're gonna learn this from Ruth chapter 3. Let me catch you up to the first 2 chapters of Ruth if you haven't been with us. So what we see is that in this story, this Old Testament story, that there was a woman named Naomi and her husband Elimelech. And they had 2 sons, and there was a famine in the nation of Israel. And so they went to the neighboring country of Moab. And there, their 2 sons married Moabite women. And then tragically, over a 10-year period, the husband, Elimelech, and the 2 sons all passed away, leaving 3 widows left behind. And so in their culture, being a widow and then also being a foreigner puts you in a vulnerable position. And so Naomi, the mother-in-law, she's got now 2 daughter-in-laws, and she tells them to go back to the Moabite families, to go back to them, be provided for by them. And so Orpah, one of them, says, peace, I'm out, right? And she goes back to her family. But the other one, Ruth, she has now met the living God, the true God of Israel. And she says, no, I'm gonna make your God my God, and your people my people, and I will cling to you. And she chooses faith in God, trust in God, and faithfulness to God's people. And she goes with Naomi to Israel. And these 2 widows in ancient Israel go to Bethlehem. Now, in this, what I want you to see is that Ruth, she could have turned back. She could have gone back to her Moabite family and been better provided for, but she takes a risk. And she risks it all on her faith in God and her faithfulness to her mother-in-law. And what I want us to see this morning is that her faithfulness and her willingness to be determined to continue to walk faithfully alongside Naomi, it not only impacts Ruth's life, but it also impacts in a positive way and blesses the life of Naomi. Not only that, there's another character we need to meet in this story, a man named Boaz. He's the 3rd character in the story that we're gonna see this today. And Boaz, he's a wealthy, godly Israelite. And what we're gonna see is that he has social influence, and he uses his generosity and what God has blessed him with, his time, talents, and treasures, in order to bless both of these other women, these 2 widows. We're gonna see that impact today. So we're gonna see this impact of Ruth's faithfulness, and I want you to think about in your own life, your own social influence that could happen, and what God might do in your life and through your life as we look at the story together. But what I want you to notice is Naomi at the beginning of the story. So in Ruth chapter 1, what we see is Naomi, that as she comes up with a new name for herself, I'll put it on the screen here, verse 20-21 says this, she says, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, which is the Hebrew term bitter. She says, call me Mara because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. She goes on to say, I went away full when I left Israel and went to Moab. I was full, I had a husband, I had 2 sons, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Everybody say empty. The Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? She says, call me Mara, which means bitter. The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So she comes back and she is empty in her own words, that God has turned his hand against me. And she now says, don't call me Naomi, call me bitter. That's her new name tag, right? And so she is now a widow, and her christianmingle.com, right? She's got a photo and her bio just has one word, bitter. right? Not very attractive, right? Not a great way to find a new mate. Bitter, right? She's angry at God, and she's complaining, and she's turned into that bitter old woman that hopefully no one in this room has become, right? But we can become like that as we begin to complain, and we go, look at my circumstances, look at my difficulty, look at my pain, and we begin to get bitter and angry towards God. But a shift happens in the story. And what we're going to see is that the hand of God has been working behind the scenes throughout chapter 2, that the hand of God is not against Naomi, but the hand of God is moving behind the scenes on her behalf, and she's about to be blessed and experience God's blessing because of Ruth, her daughter-in-law. So with that in mind, are you guys ready to study God's word this morning? All right, let's power on a Bible, open up a Bible to Ruth chapter 3. Ruth chapter 3, why don't you turn there right now? And what we see is that during chapter 2, Ruth has been given provision and protection by Boaz. She's been gleaning in Boaz's field, and in ancient Israel, they had set up this way for foreigners and for widows and orphans to be provided for. And so she's able to go in his fields, and she's been going for a number of weeks now and collecting the extra food that's left after they are harvesting the barley. But now we read in chapter 3, verse 1, it says this: one day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. Now, Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours." And so let me just pause and say this. Naomi, she's looking at her daughter-in-law Ruth, and she's been faithful and has followed her now to Israel, to Bethlehem, and she's been gleaning for a number of weeks in this field. But she says, hey, I need to find a home for you, a permanent way for you to be provided for. And Boaz happens to be one of our relatives. And so she says, hey, let's get your christianmingle.com bio up, right? And we'll write the bio and we'll get the picture up. But the only problem is, if you look closely at the picture of Ruth all dialed in the background, there's this old bitter woman named Naomi, right? It's a 2-for-1 package deal that's going on here. But she says, hey, we need to get you a husband. We need to get you out there. And so Naomi pushes Ruth back into the dating world. And she continues. She says, tonight, Boaz will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Now, I got a picture of the threshing floor, and what would have happened is, as they are harvesting, they would have then taken the grain, or this time the barley, up the hill to this threshing room floor, which was made out of stone. It was a hard surface, and there they would beat it, and then they would lift it with like a pitchfork and throw it into the wind, and the chaff, the casing would fly off the hill because of the wind, and the good stuff would fall to the ground. And then they would pile that up, and then they would spend the night during the harvest season there next to their pile of grain, their barley, because they wanted to protect it from someone coming and stealing what they had worked so hard for. And so Naomi sends Ruth there with some very specific instructions. Verse 3 says this: wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking and he's in a good mood, right? When he lies down, note the place where Boaz is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. And Ruth responds, I will do whatever you say. Now, parents, don't you just wish that your kids would say that to you? Go clean your room. I will do whatever you say, right? So she says this to her mother-in-law, and then it says verse 6. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. So Naomi instructs Ruth, and she says to go and take a bath, go put on some perfume, go put on your best dress. And what she's saying is, you need to stop the season of grieving. Stop the season of mourning, and you need to put out the bat signal and let people know that you are single and you are ready to mingle. And so I want you, that's what's going on here, is to move from grieving to saying, hey, I'm available. And so she listens to these instructions and she follows them faithfully. In verse 7 it says this: when Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. Well, duh, right? And he turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. Now, this is not an episode of The Bachelor. This is not like Real Housewives of Orange County, okay? This is not some scandalous moment. Ruth is not being scandalous here, but she was taking a huge risk. And Ruth's actions of uncovering Boaz's feet, what this was an ancient custom of her saying, hey, I'm available. And she's requesting his hand in marriage. What she is saying is, Boaz, would you marry me? Which was her taking a huge risk because she is a foreigner. She is a Moabite woman. And so she is taking a risk because Boaz could have rejected this proposal. A wealthy, well-respected Israelite landowner did not need to typically marry a poor foreign woman. There's also here the opportunity for him to take advantage of her. She's powerless and he's powerful. But we see he responds in verse 9. He says, who are you? He doesn't know who this is. Who are you? He asked. She said, I am your servant Ruth, he said. She said this to him, spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. Everybody say guardian redeemer. You are a guardian redeemer or a kinsman redeemer of our family, she says. So it's important for us to understand this concept of a guardian redeemer or a kinsman redeemer. And this was a way in ancient Israel for them to be able to provide for a family member, extended family member who did not have a male son or no longer had a husband. And so what would have happened is if someone passed away, a husband had passed away and left a wife who had no children, then there was no way for their family name to go on, no way for their lineage to go on. And Ruth and Naomi, they own land, but they have no male son. They have no husband, which meant they had no future. They had no way to provide for themselves or protect themselves. And so oftentimes that these widows would then go into debt and they would lose their land and they would lose their hope and they would lose their future. And so God had provided a way for this kinsman redeemer or a family redeemer, which a brother or a cousin or an uncle would then buy that land and take that widow as their own wife, and they would have children with them, and they would raise those kids not for their own benefit, but this would have been for Elimelech's name and for his benefit and to carry on his lineage and to allow for a future and a hope for Naomi and for Ruth. And so Ruth and Naomi, they need a kinsman redeemer. And Boaz, as it turned out, in God's sovereign plan, in God's providence, happens to be a potential guardian redeemer. And so Ruth is asking, will you marry me? Will you redeem me? Will you buy me back into the family and provide a hope and a future for me? But what I want you to notice here is that Ruth isn't just doing this for herself. She says, you're a guardian redeemer for our family. That Ruth could have stayed back in Moab and been provided for by her family there, but she took a risk and she stepped out in faith and she walked in faithfulness, and the payoff wasn't just for her, but for Naomi. And that this guardian redeemer, it was a 2-for-1 deal, right? Look at the Christian Mingle bio, like it's not just Ruth, but there's Naomi, the bitter mother-in-law, right in the background, right? This is a 2-for-1 deal. And Ruth's faith and her faithfulness will not only impact her life and her future, but Naomi's life and future as well. And I want you to catch this principle, church family, that your faith and your faithfulness to God won't just impact your future, but it's also impact your family, your friends, and others. And I couldn't think of something that started with an F there until this morning. Other folk. Okay, there we go, other folks. But your faith and your faithfulness, your trust in God and your character, your integrity, your faithfulness, your yes to God, it not only impacts your future, but I want you to tell you this morning that it also impacts your friends, your family, and other folks as well. That your life is not an isolated individual life, but you are a part of a collective, part of a whole. And I want you to see this morning that your life matters, that your faith in God matters, that your faithfulness to God matters, that your decision to walk in purity and say, hey, I want to live God's ways. I want to walk in purity in my relationships. I want to walk in purity in my marriage. It won't just impact you, but it'll impact other people as well. I want you to see that your decision to grow in your faith, to begin to read the Bible and take your faith seriously, it not only impacts your life and your faith, but it impacts your friends and your family as well. I want you to see that your decision to say yes to God's plans for you, yes to God's prompting in your life, it doesn't just impact you. It impacts your spouse, it impacts your children, it impacts your classmates, it impacts your neighbor, your family, and your friends. I want you to see that the addiction that you're struggling with, it doesn't just impact you. It impacts the people around you. I want you to see that the greed in your life, and the decision to go, God, I sense, God, that you're wanting to break the sin of greed in my life and to move me to a place of generosity towards others, that it doesn't just impact you, but it impacts the world around you as well. I want you to see this morning that your faith in God and your faithfulness to Him and going, hey, I've got this area of my heart, this area of my life, I've got this anger that I need to deal with, that anger doesn't just impact you, but it impacts your friends, your family, and others. And we see here Ruth, she took a risk, which impacted Naomi's life. And she's put it all out on the line. And she's waiting now to see how is Boaz going to respond. And given the spiritual climate of Israel at the time, this is the time of the judges. Given the spiritual climate and the culture at the time, an average Israelite might have welcomed this night visit of a woman as an opportunity for his own pleasure, but not with Boaz. Verse 10, it says this, Boaz says this, "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. In other words, don't fear, right? Boaz is here, okay? So he's saying it's okay. He says, this kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier, the kindness that you've shown Naomi. He says, this kindness is even greater. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. Well, Boaz is saying, he's saying yes. He's saying yes to the proposal. And what he's gonna go on to say next, and we don't have time to read it, but what we see is that he says there is actually someone who's a closer guardian redeemer. There's someone else in the family who is next in line before me. And so if he will redeem you, then let him do that. But if he doesn't, I will take on that responsibility and I will say yes, and I will become your husband, and I will care for you, and I will care for Naomi. And then he says this, and here's the why. All the people of my town know that you, Ruth, are a woman of noble character. You, Ruth, are a woman of noble character. In the midst of a culture that was filled with debauchery, where in Judges 21 it says this, in those days there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. It sounds a whole lot like our culture as well, where everyone just does what's right in their own eyes. And in the midst of that culture, in the harvest season, it was not a time of high morals. There was partying, there was drinking, there was prostitution, and there was a lot of bad things happening on the threshing floor. And in the midst of that, there was Ruth and Boaz, their integrity was on the line. But they are both people of noble character. Boaz is described in chapter 2, verse 1. Boaz was described as a man of noble character, the same words. And now he looks at Ruth and her life and he says, you have been faithful. You are a woman of noble character. And when everyone else in their culture was just doing what they thought was right in their own eyes, when everyone else was just living their life however they wanted, far from God, and just living for their own pleasure, these two people stand out as people of integrity, as people of character, of noble character who did the right thing. And I just lament that in our culture, we admire competency over character. That in our culture, we admire people who are competent, who have a high level of gifting, who have charisma, and we celebrate those gifted people, those competent people, and we excuse their bad behavior. That's why, no offense to Jake Paul, but someone like Jake Paul gets paid $40 million with a big personality and YouTube channel. But how they live their life, their character off screen doesn't really matter. And we can do that as a church as well, right? We rally around celebrity pastors who have incredible gifting and talent in terms of communication ability, or we platform musicians and singers that have incredible talent, and we oftentimes don't care about their character behind the scenes, right? Until there's a tragedy, until there's some big moral failing, and then we're like, how did this happen? And it happened because we value competency over character. What we see here in Ruth 3 is that God admires character, even over competency. Let me say, competency matters, but character matters more. Character matters more. Integrity matters. And here's what I want to tell you this morning is that how you live your life, even when no one's watching, that's what integrity is about. How you live your life, your character matters. It actually matters to God, and it matters to the people around you. And Boaz has character. And at high cost to himself, he says yes to becoming this guardian redeemer for this family. And Ruth has character. At high cost to herself, she's willing to go to a foreign country in order to help this bitter mother-in-law named Naomi. And it's through Ruth and Boaz, both their faith and their faithfulness, that we see this blessing and favor come upon Naomi's life, that she gets blessed. Remember at the beginning I told you that in Ruth chapter 1, right? We see that she says, I used to be full, but I came back empty. Well, watch this in verse 15. Boaz, as he's sending Ruth to go back to Naomi, he said this, bring me the shawl you were wearing and hold it out. And when she did, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then he went back to town. And that's 70 pounds of barley. Okay, so Ruth, she's the original CrossFitter, okay? She's got 70 pounds of barley on her head that she is now walking back home to her mother-in-law. And it says, when Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, how did it go, my daughter? Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, don't go back to your mother-in-law, there's that word again, empty-handed. What I want you to see in Ruth chapter 3 is that Naomi, her life goes from, I've been dealt a bad hand, I am bitter, I am complaining that God has turned his hand against me, my life is empty, to now, her hand is now full, her life is now full, she is no longer empty-handed, that redemption has come to her home, that redemption has come to her life, and it's been because of the faith and faithfulness of Ruth. You see, church family, your faithfulness might result in blessing in other people's lives in ways that you can't currently see. That your faith and your faithfulness to God might bless other people in ways that you don't yet see. And I want to ask you, what legacy will your character leave behind you? What legacy are you going to leave with the life that you live, the faith that you live? What legacy of character are you going to leave behind you? You see, you might not see, even in your lifetime, the impact of your faithfulness and your faith in God. There might be moments you see it, but you don't yet recognize the ways that God is going to work through your life as he works in your life right now. As you say, yes, God, I want your plans. God, yes, I want to be the person you've called me to be. God, I want the character that you've called me to be. I want to deal with this addiction. God, I want to become a person of generosity. You don't yet see the impact that might have for the people around you. and for future generations. And as I think about this, I think about my parents. My mom and dad, they were born and raised in Winnipeg, Canada, and I was born and raised in Winnipeg, Canada as well. But when I was 13 years old, my parents felt God calling them to move to California, to move to the United States. And they said yes with great risk and with a huge move and financial implications and all kinds of things. But they said yes, and they moved in faith, trusting God. And they had no idea at the time how it was going to impact their 3 sons who moved with them. They had no idea how it was going to impact their children, me, and their grandchildren and future generations by a decision for them to say yes in faith to God. But they stepped out in faith, and it changed the trajectory of our lives and the lives of many others. I want to invite the band to begin to get in place. And I want to say this. In this story, you might be someone like Boaz who's been blessed. There's some good things going on in your life. Or you might be like Ruth, and you've been through some difficulty and through loss and through pain. But whatever character in the story that you identify with, I want you to recognize that your life can have an influence on others. And it's through your faith and your faithfulness to God. It might result in a blessing to other people's lives in ways you can't currently see. You see, we only see the micro story. We only see, our circumstances and the small bits that God has revealed to us, but God has a bigger picture. God has a bigger story that he is writing. And little spoiler alert, Boaz ends up redeeming these 2 women. And spoiler alert, the genealogy at the end of Ruth, that we're going to see next week, tells us that in the lineage of Ruth and Boaz ends up King David and eventually Jesus himself. That God was taking the story of Naomi and Ruth, these 2 poor widows, and the story of Boaz, this man of noble character. And God was redeeming the story. God was redeeming their lives through the faith and faithfulness of these 2. God was redeeming their story and weaving it into the tapestry of his micro story, the macro story of redemption for the world. And so we're going to celebrate communion right now together. And as we celebrate communion, we're celebrating the guardian redeemer, that we have a redeemer, Jesus. And that the macro story was pointing to the future and the hope that you and I have in Jesus Christ. And so your story, no matter how bad it's been, no matter how difficult it's been, that things could change. That maybe you, like Naomi, you've gotten to a place where you're bitter and you're hurting and you're in pain, but guess what? There is a Redeemer. And he is here. And he sees you and he wants to redeem your life. He wants to buy you back. That Jesus, he went to the cross on your behalf, knowing that you and I would not be faithful, that we would sin and fall short. But he invites us into his family through his blood shed for us. And so as we remember and we celebrate that together, I want to encourage you to move beyond just the receiving of God's blessing in our life and the receiving of his grace, but also to go, God, I want my life to be a surrendered life of saying, yes, God, to the plans you have for me. God, would you use my life to help redeem other people? God, that your love and your grace at work in my life, changing me. God, would you change my character? God, would you give me integrity? Would you give me faith? And I would be faithful, God, and that you would use my life to impact the world around me. With that in mind, would you stand with me as we pray and we go into this time of communion? Jesus, we want to respond to the gospel. We want to respond to the good news that we see hints of in the book of Ruth. God, that you are the great Redeemer. God, that we all were once lost, broken, foreigners. God, that we were all in need spiritually of your healing touch and your grace and your provision. So God, I just pray that we would reflect on that right now, God, that we would receive your grace, your love, God, that we would give thanks, God, and have gratitude. That as we put our trust in you, God, that you place your Holy Spirit inside of us. That we put our hope and our trust in you, God, that you buy us back and redeem us. And as you do that, God, that you redeem our purpose, God, that we can have influence and significance, God, that our lives can be woven into the tapestry of the macro story of what you're doing, God, to redeem this world, God, to redeem our community, God, to redeem our family and our neighborhoods. And so, God, I pray that we would say yes to surrendering our lives, God, and our stories to your greater story of redemption. God, would you give us greater faith? God, would you help us to have faithfulness? And God, would it bring not only a future for us, but for our friends, our family, and others as well. We pray this in Jesus' mighty name.